Twitch channel just playing music. Do something. Please not play music without me. My Twitch channel just playing music. Do something. Please not play music without me. My Twitch channel just playing music. No music. Do something. Please not play music without me. My Twitch channel just playing music. No music. Do something. Please not play music without me. My Twitch channel just playing music. No music. Hold on. I need music. What's up, Bleach? How's the sound, Bleach? You gotta tell me if it's balanced, if you can hear me alright. If the music's not too loud. How about now? Cool. What did I do here? There we go. Puzzle game articles for everybody. We just don't want puzzle games. That's a lot of stuff. So right now, selecting puzzle from the genre drop down just makes it to where everything that even talks about a puzzle game as its main game is included. Dr. Mario. Well, what we're looking for is something a little bit more focused. Fortunately, I have a few interesting videos in my YouTube. There's a lot of recent stuff about The Witness, which we'll get to later in the week. But there's one particularly good video I want to go over. The soundtrack is Crashmo. It is the second game in the Pushmo series. Pushmo, Crashmo, Pushmo World, and then Stretchmo. Yeah, I own them all. I think Crashmo has one of the best soundtracks of the games. Look at this. So this is one of the really good videos I wanted to go over on stream. Just something for us to listen to, take a look at, something to think about before we really hit into some heavy topics later in the week. So this particular one. There we go. So here, it's the information on the side. Pretty high in difficulty, pretty low in scope is what we're looking for. Relatively high in argumentation, 3. Goes over some examples with really high quality. This is something that will really get our feet wet for this particular topic. It's done by Game Design Ed, and it is not too long. I don't know how long it is, but we're going to give it a listen. Feel free to leave questions in the chat. Okay, here we go. Turn this up.
Hi, Game Design Ed here, and I'm back playing around with Puzzle Explorer. Today I want to show you how to build a logic puzzle. Puzzle Explorer's game design curriculum, as you remember, begins with simple maze design in the Yucatan Peninsula. Mazes, as you also remember, are puzzles in which a player attempts to reach a goal on a game board by finding the correct path within a complex, branching network of paths. Guess what? We'll continue to use what we learned about mazes when we move on to build logic puzzles. That's the scaffolding curriculum of Puzzle Explorer. So let's build a logic puzzle. Let's travel to the Antarctica. Here in Antarctica, just like at the Yucatan Peninsula, there are easy to follow step-by-step multimedia instructions, but here these instructions build on the maze design that we learned at the Yucatan, adding elements such as pushable objects, portals, and different types of ground that affect the player's movement. These elements help you build complex interactions for your logic puzzles. What is a logic puzzle? A logic puzzle is a puzzle that requires rational calculation to solve, whether using inductive, abductive, deductive, or other type of reasoning. That is, to solve a logic puzzle, the player must be able to hold the puzzle as a system in their head in order to think a few steps ahead of their current situation, looking at both the individual parts of the puzzle and the puzzle as a whole in order to both make and test hypotheses about how to solve it. Basically, a logic puzzle challenges the player's mind and takes more complex thinking to solve than a maze does. So, let's build a logic puzzle. Let's start by building a maze. A maze, as you remember, is a great foundation for puzzle design. Now let's do some things that will challenge the player's mind and make this a logic puzzle. Let's add some icy paths that the player has to enter and exit at the correct spots. Let's add some ice blocks and snowballs that the player has to push into the correct positions. Let's add some portals that the player has to enter at the correct time and in the correct direction. And let's make it so the player has to do all of these things in a certain order to solve the puzzle. As you remember, this is called sequencing. Although I could, and probably should, I'm not going to play out each step and lay out all of the possible choices the player could make, like I did in the video How to Make the Player Stop and Think. That was a good video about logic puzzles as well. Check out that link for that video below. In this video, I just want to look at 3 parts of the puzzle. This snowball, this combination of pushable objects, and this portal, and how we are limiting the number of times the player can travel through it. Let's test it out. So let's look at the snowball. It's the first meaningful decision we have to make. We walk up to this snowball. Should we push it or leave it? What would happen if we pushed it? It would block the camera. What would happen if we left it? We would have to come back to it later. But notice the broken ice next to it. Getting back to it won't be easy. But we should leave it. There will be a lot of steps between our first encounter and our final encounter with this snowball, so I just wanted to point it out right now. The player has to think quite a few steps ahead with this snowball, and then return to it. This really tests the player's mind, getting them to think this far ahead. So we leave the snowball for now, break these 2 blocks of thin ice, and now we're down here by a bunch of pushable objects. There's a certain combination that we need to crack in order to pass this part of the puzzle. So while the player has to plan far into the future with the snowball, the player has a more immediate logical task with these pushable objects. But it isn't less challenging. Even though the player doesn't have to plan far into the future with this challenge, they do have to be able to hold a lot of different possibilities in their head. This is difficult to do. So what if I push the first snowball down? What if I don't? Either way, you lead to multiple different possibilities. If we push it down, we could go under these ice blocks and push them up. We can push these snowballs to the right and get the camera. But we won't be able to go back. Let's leave it, forcing us to slide down. Now we can push this ice block down, and then push this snowball over. But that breaks our access to the camera. We then have to waste this snowball, and then push the ice block over. And then we can finally push this snowball up. What should we do with this other ice block? We could push it to the right toward the camera, or up to fill this hole above. We'll push it up for now. This combination of pushable objects is a neat little puzzle within the bigger puzzle. It forces the player to hold a lot of different possibilities in their head. Moving on. Let's move up. Get the camera and push this snowball down. And let's go through this portal. We have now gone through the portal once. If we step off the portal in either direction, we break some thin ice. What happens if we go down first to get the camera? Well, let's try it. We break the ice and slide to the first camera. We can push the ice block to make a bridge and get the second camera. We then come back up, and we can't push the snowball out of the way to get back to the portal. We're stuck. So let's try the other way. We slide to the left, breaking two thin ice blocks and pushing the pushable ice block into the water, making an ice bridge. So let's slide across that. We break some more thin ice. Here we're back to where we started at the beginning of the puzzle, and we're back face to face with the snowball. So a quick aside for the snowball. This is another good thing to do in a logic puzzle. Interleave different aspects of the puzzle. The player is trying to hold a lot of information in their heads, and we usually like to put that information in a linear order. So interleave the aspects of your puzzle to challenge your player's mind to be able to think about multiple things across different time frames. Some immediate, like the combination of pushable objects that we discussed, and some spaced out across longer periods of time, like with the snowball. So, should we push the snowball now? Well, the reason we didn't push it before was so that we didn't block the camera. The camera is now gone, so that's out of the way. Do we have to move the snowball now? Yes, if we have to move it at all, we have to move it now. We won't be able to get back on this side of the snowball again. The thin ice on the left side of the portal is broken, so we can't go that way again. And we can't slide up to this side of the snowball again because there is more broken thin ice. So if we're going to push it, we need to push it now, and we can only push it down. It will block our path to the compass. So is that a good idea? Well, there is one more span of water that we'll have to get across to get the compass, and we could use the snowball to make a snow bridge. So it could prove useful, but how will we be able to push it down there? We'll have to push it over in front of the portal and then push it down when we come out of the portal. So let's push it in there. And we are back to talking about the portal. We've already gone through it once, and we won't be able to come out that same way again. We'll need to go through it to get at least one of the two cameras on the right side of the puzzle. So let's go through the portal again. And this time, we can only go down. We break the ice and get the camera. We push the ice block down to make an ice bridge and get the second camera. We can then come back and push the snowball, making a snow bridge that'll allow us to go back into the portal. We're not stuck anymore. So with the portal, we've limited the number of times the players can go through it. Well, I guess they can go through it as many times as they want now, but there wouldn't be any reason to. I think the important part of this is that they couldn't just pass through the portal whenever they wanted. There were consequences. If they went through it at the wrong time or went the wrong direction, it wouldn't work anymore, and you can't build a bridge to bypass the portal either, so the player has to use it. They had to complete things in a certain order. This, as you remember, is called sequencing. It takes some rational calculation to figure out how to use this set of portals correctly. So let's step through the portal again. Now we're face to face with this pesky snowball again. The snowball has now been something that we've returned to for the entire duration of the puzzle. It's the first thing we face, and it's now the last thing. All we have to do now is push it down to make a snow bridge, and then we get the compass. So there are 3 techniques that you can add to your game design tool belts to use when making logical puzzles. 1. Make the player hold a lot of things in their heads at once to solve some aspect of the puzzle, like the combination of pushable objects. 2. Make the player hold things in their head for varying time frames. Some challenges should be immediate, like the combination of pushable objects, and some should be spread out across the duration of the puzzle, like with the snowball. Vary the time frame of your logical challenges. 3. Make the player hold different things in their head at once. Players want to put things in a linear order, so interleave the aspects of your puzzle to challenge your player's mind to be able to think about multiple things across different time frames. Some immediate, like the combination of pushable objects, and some spaced out across longer periods of time, like with the snowball, and some in between, like with the portals. So that concludes our second stop, Antarctica, in the game design curriculum of Puzzle Explorer, where we learned how to build a logic puzzle. This is Game Design Ed. Thanks for playing.
So yeah, Game Design Ed is one of the few that I've seen who had really gave the criteria for creating and breaking down logic puzzles. The only person that I've seen who really sort of differentiated between deductive, adductive, and what was the last one? Maybe it's in the notes here. So inductive, deductive, and adductive reasoning. See, it's really helpful for IDEO. All the helpful tags and keywords are right here in case you forget things. It makes it really handy for looking up information and recalling it. But yeah, in this particular example, his 3-part criteria is in the DO summary. So all you have to do is remember the word logic puzzle or game design ed, so on and so forth, and you can find this information really quickly for your reference. It's just a really good video. Let's see what else Ed has to offer. It's the only video I got. I need to do more work. So it seems like Ed has a few more videos, one where he talks about mazes and one where he talks about other kinds of puzzles, but that really kicks us off at a really good start. We're going to go back to finding a few more videos on puzzle game design. Take a listen and watch of those, all to prepare us for talking about The Witness and other puzzle games throughout the week later. So this is a really good, just sort of get your feet wet, simple way of getting your head in the right space and even learning a few terms that you might need. So right now we got like inductive, abductive, and deductive reasoning, which is kind of like a really handy way of understanding, breaking down reasoning in the first place. A lot of people say, you know, make things logical, make your systems coherent, you know, and build these systems for your game players to play in. But you know, the rules themselves can be one way, but then the level design can force you to embrace those rules or understand them in various ways, and having these words is pretty helpful. There's a Game Maker's Toolkit on Jonathan Blows puzzles here. That we'll probably better watch later. People talk about Portal. Blast Core is not a puzzle game. Here's an interesting one by Mark Brown. We'll take a look at this one. You guys can see that? Yeah, this one. Alright, you can see that one. Kill this. Here we go.
Hi, this is Mark Brown with Game Maker's Toolkit, a series on video game design. Infinifactory is one of the funniest games I've played this year, which is pretty impressive considering the fact that it's not really a comedy game. To get the joke, you need to know how the game works. In each level, you must fabricate some complicated structure, like this 5-piece cross thing, by building a production line that transports and manipulates blocks that plop out of a hole in the wall. You build your machine with chunky cubic blocks like conveyor belts, pushers, optical sensors, rotators, and welders. After spending an hour carefully building a machine to forge that 5-piece cross, I finally got it to work. But Infinifactory wants you to make 10 perfect copies of the structure to prove that your machine is actually a functioning production line. So I let the machine run a few more times, confident that it would spit out 9 more perfect crosses. And then this happened. The sheer absurdity of it, the insane comic timing, the slack-jawed disbelief of how stupidly crap my monstrously complicated machine was, it had me doubled over in stitches laughing at it. It was either that or cry. The opportunity for impromptu comedy is not the only thing that sets the games of Zach Barth apart from other puzzlers. In fact, they feel so fundamentally different that to put a game like Infinifactory in the same puzzle genre as games such as the Talos Principle and Snakebird might be doing it a great disservice. Because when you play Portal, you're trying to discover the solution to the puzzle, whereas in Infinifactory you are literally inventing a solution. And the use of the and a in that sentence is important because typical puzzle games have just one answer. Maybe there's a couple alternative solutions, or you could tweak the main answer slightly, or there is a solution that the developer never intended. But in Infinifactory, the possible solutions are infinite. Well, sort of. There's a lot of them, at least. Which is shown very clearly in these end-of-level histograms that show how efficient your solution is compared to every other player on Steam in both your use of time and space. That also sets Barth's games apart from other puzzlers. It's practically pointless to play the same puzzle twice in The Swapper, but it's genuinely enjoyable to return to a completed Infinifactory puzzle and try to make your solution more productive. So maybe we should stop saying these games are about solving puzzles and say they're actually about solving problems. These are games where you have a goal, some materials, a limited workspace and some tools. Your job is to reach that goal in any way you can. That is why these games feel less like unravelling contrived riddles, and more like solving real-world problems. Like making production lines in Infinifactory, plotting efficient train lines in Mini Metro, making spaceships in Kerbal Space Program, or writing code in SpaceChem. Yeah, SpaceChem has actually got way more to do with coding than chemistry, right down to the logic gates and subroutines and debugging. And that's cool for 2 reasons. One, programming is basically the best puzzle game in the world because it's truly open-ended and it's wonderfully satisfying to dream up, jot down, iterate upon and execute some totally unique solution to the overwhelmingly complex problem at hand. And 2, it means that the game and those like it can be truly educational without being educational games. SpaceChem was actually used in a few schools in the UK, according to the trade association Tiger. Similarly, Minecraft's Redstone, a mineral that lets players wire up mechanised contraptions, is introducing tons of players to simple coding. Or not so simple, Minecrafters have used Redstone to make a calculator, a GPU that can draw shapes, and an 8-track sequencer that can belt out Pachelbel's Bell's Canon in D. By the way, Zach Barth also made the blocky competitive mining game Infiniminer that would directly influence Minecraft, so he probably dies a little inside every time you say that Infinifactory controls like Minecraft. Just a heads up. His other games, if you want to search them out, are also notable problem solvers. That includes games like the Codex of Alchemical Engineering, which is about programming commands into rotating arms to transfer imaginary minerals. Bureau of Steam Engineering, which is about connecting up boilers to steam-powered weapons on a robot, and Cocktepike Engineer of the People, which is an almost impenetrable game about designing integrated circuits to meet specifications. And in the new game from his studio Zachtronics, which is called TIS-100, you literally write simple assembly code into these blocks to manipulate data. You're even encouraged to print out a PDF reference manual with all the commands and instructions that you need. This seems to be part of a trend of programmers making games about programming. In 2D Boy's next game, Human Resource Machine, you write commands for office workers so they can automatically complete jobs. And in Quadrilateral Cowboy by Blendo Games, you write commands into a DOS-like interface to shut off alarms and unlock doors so you can break into highly secure buildings. The point is that if you play any of these games, you'll clearly see that by taking inspiration from real-world problems like programming or engineering, games like SpaceChem and World of Goo can actually be more fun than those built from arbitrary puzzles. You get the satisfaction of making something work and the comedy of making something that doesn't. The same problems can be played multiple times as you try to make a more efficient solution, and it might be easier to make the levels themselves. In a post-mortem on SpaceChem, Barth revealed that his puzzle creation process was essentially to throw together interesting inputs and outputs, make sure the puzzles can be solved, and then reorder all the levels based on difficulty. Don't take this as me saying that I want to bin traditional puzzle games. The Witness, for example, is one of my most anticipated games at the moment. Take it more as a friendly reminder that this is still a small, burgeoning group of games, and there are still loads of real-world problems to take inspiration from in your new, open-ended, problem-solving game. Thanks for watching. Let me know your favourite problem-solving puzzler in the comments. Also, please like the episode, consider kicking in a few bucks a show on Patreon, and if you want to know the second a new episode is out, subscribe to the channel on YouTube.
Alright. Lots of things to say about that video, but one particular part that I like is that it's one of the videos Mark Brown created before he actually got a chance to play The Witness. So this being the first episode in our week-long deep dive into The Witness, it's kind of neat to hear the kinds of things that people talk about before actually getting their hands on the main game. As you can see here in Design Oriented, lots of quotes pulled out from Mark Brown's video. He says a lot of different things, so having some of the most important statements that he makes right here handy on the main area is pretty good. You can check out some of that here. You can check out the games he mentioned here in case you want to see what other people are saying about those games or whatever Dio has to offer in terms of finding additional hits. Here's a summary that's just taken from his YouTube summary page. So one of the kind of important considerations that was brought up in the video is if an additional distinction needs to be made between problem solving and puzzle solving. You know, he didn't really define what a puzzle game was at the top, so just kind of hitting the ground rolling and moving through his argument is kind of how the video played out. But for our purposes and what we're trying to do this week, really, it would help to have some really clear ideas of what we're talking about. You know, where the clear distinctions are and where the gray areas are in terms of puzzle game design and, you know, what makes it good, what makes it very different from the pure active programming or just solving things in general. So that's definitely something we will get to. But these are just interesting considerations for you. In general, I don't think puzzle games are a very popular topic, but you know, the timeline on DM can really just help us see one way or another how much is out there. Or not. Pretty good timeline. There we go. Oh, lots of videos. What are these about? Okay, some go back to 2013. Oh, so Game Maker's Toolkit did another video about sequence breaking, which is cool because you can see this video here. I'll click on it. It's black yellow. Yellow is our color for level design. And what we learned from Game Design Ed's video is that for a logic puzzle, sequencing is kind of a big deal. What you force the players to do and how they come to the information to learn what the correct path is, and then how much information they have to hold in their head at any given point to realize what correct ways to go is kind of important. So the idea of sequence breaking is really similar. It's sort of right there next to it. So I'm going to drag one of these up here. We're going to get our yellow level design bubble, something like that. Just on this cursory survey of puzzle games and puzzle game design. Ooh, I saw something on Tetris. Oh, so here's another good one. The do's and don'ts of honest puzzle game design right here. We'll take a look at this. Let's see. Which one first? Does the chat have any opinion? Should we watch another Mark Brown and do a double Mark Brown back to back, or should we do this one first? The do's and don'ts of honest puzzle design. I don't think either of them are rated, so I'll get a chance to score those. Try this.
Believe it or not, but Tokitori 2 was one of the most daring and ingeniously designed puzzle games of 2013. I say that because it's a Metroidvania game where you aren't stopped by doors you can't open or blocks you can't break. The only thing stopping you from breaking off the main road to forge your own path is just basic knowledge of how the game works. Before I get to that, let me define a Metroidvania. Back in the day, most games were split up into levels and they followed one after the other in order. Then games like Metroid came along, squished all the levels together into one contiguous world map and jumbled up the order. This means that during your adventure you might come across a door that you can't access yet, until you unlock a new item that will let you through, so now you have to retrace your steps to get back to that obstacle and bypass it. There are now loads of these games, including Metroid and Castlevania of course, as well as Shantae and Shadow Complex and Strider and Guacamelee and more. But they all generally do the same thing. Bits of the world are completely inaccessible until you get the next power-up, meaning that these games aren't truly about exploration at all. You're still on a predetermined path, only there's a lot more backtracking. So enter Tokitori 2, a game which does something quite different. You only have two abilities in this game. You can tweet and you can stomp. And that's it, you never get any more powers or items. You do learn some songs that let you respawn, jump to the map screen, take a picture or view your location, but they don't actually unlock any new areas. Instead of abilities, the game has a complicated ecosystem of creatures that all act and interact in different ways, and you advance by manipulating these critters. You might tweet to move this platform near to you, or use fireflies to disable these masks. The main pathway, as much as there is one, introduces you to these concepts slowly and doesn't let you advance until you've got it, so in this very early section we have to learn about making bubbles to ride up to this next area. Along the way, checkpoints linger just out of view so you know where you should be going. But at any time you can break off from this path, even if the majority of first-time players don't even realise they can. Take this very early area. We came in from the left and it seems like all we can do is move to the right. Then again, we could lure this bird over here to get up to here, then use this water to grow this grass so we can sneak past the other birds, then use this little animal friend to clear the gap. But you probably won't, because you don't officially learn about luring birds until this part of the game, or growing grass until you do this puzzle, or using those repeater bugs until you get to this section. If you do manage to get up here and then wander off to the left, you've reached a part of the game that most players won't actually access until much later on. It's sequence breaking, you know, the way that industrious players use cheats and glitches to bypass bits of level, but made official. Here's another example. In this section we fall down and our only option is to go left. The stairs on the right are too steep and we can't jump, remember? But we later learn about herding fireflies, so when we eventually come back to this area, we'll know to bring these little guys down with us to wake up this sleepy purple monster, who will feed to this frog who gives us a bubble to get up here. And in this section, these electric critters are in our way. Later on in the game we'll get taught how to disable them by stomping while wet, but maybe you'll figure that out before you're supposed to, and then start to explore the game on your own terms. That's kind of the magic of Tokitori 2. Exploration in this game feels real and organic because you can discover your own path at any time, and your options are never limited by your abilities. If you can't advance, it's only because you can't work out what you're supposed to do. The main path eventually brings you to this area, where you find that the main goal of the game is to lure these 5 frogs to these warp holes, and you can do that in any order you like, which again reinforces the sense of discovery and exploration. Likewise, one other goal in the game sees you collecting these shards to activate these stones to open up this gate, and you can collect them however you like. It's always up to you. Now, I don't think that every game, or even every Metroidvania, should try this. It's a ballsy move, because if you don't tune it just right, players can break the order all over the place, miss vital bits of knowledge, and get lost or stuck or fed up. But it's just nice to be trusted with the way you plot out your adventure for once. So many games these days hold your hand with helpful companions, endless tutorials, and big compasses that point you in the right direction. Tokitori 2 has no tutorials, no words at all actually outside its logo, and it respects your intelligence in a very satisfying way. This one has gone overlooked, but I think it deserves more attention. Don't be fooled by its cutesy exterior. This PC and Wii U puzzler is wicked smart and also devilishly tricky at times.
So yeah, that was a really good example of a video that keeps a really tight scope. Hey, it's Telos, what's up? Unlike most pieces of criticism, unlike most games, unlike most of the way people think, they usually overscope and keep expanding the scope as they search for something meaningful to express whatever it is they're trying to talk about. But in this case, which is very much unlike Mark Brown's other videos, he only wants to talk about sequence breaking in this one particular game, which is a sub-topic of level design, and he stayed completely within that focus. He introduced the game briefly so that you could understand exactly what he's talking about, especially making note that the fact that you only have 2 real unique mechanics besides moving. You have the chirp and the stomp, and that's all you do the whole game, and that's kind of important to know. But then beyond that, he just kept talking about all these different examples and cases where you can go up and do things out of order, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, it's a really cool example. It kind of gives us lots of interesting things to talk about and think about in terms of puzzle game design, because in this particular case, Tokitori is a puzzle game. And he was comparing it to how the level design unfolds in other 2D shooter action games like Super Metroid. I don't think a lot of his examples are sequence breaking. It kind of depends, right? If you put secrets in your game and the player doesn't know to check, like for example, to go backwards at the start of the level, and they just miss that fact the whole game, and they go back and like, oh wait, now that I know that going backwards is kind of a thing, let me check, oh, I found a secret. That's not an example of sequence breaking. And if the game doesn't really have a sequence in the first place, and it's just like, hey, tackle these robot masters in Mega Man in any order you want, that's not sequence breaking either. It's kind of like a fine line to talk about a level design topic like this, because first you need to have a game or establish what the main sequence is before you can establish how cleverly, uniquely, or effectively a game does sequence breaking. But it's still one of the best parts about the video is he gave lots of examples. I think he gave 4 good ones, right? And most articles, most things within our database, they don't really get up to 4 examples, which is kind of like, it kind of worrisome sometimes when people can't list 4 examples of whatever they're talking about. But you know, that's just one way or the other. You have to get your point across. If you can get it done with 1 example, that's great. If you can get it done with more, that's usually better. Gives more people more things to look at, more examples to cross compare. I actually own Tokitori 2. I have it on Steam and I was playing it, and I did notice a lot of the same things he was talking about. I was like, did I just fall off the thingy and do a thing before they wanted me to go here, because I thought I had to go right, but I actually fell down here and I have to figure out how to get back. Kind of neat. I don't know how layered the gameplay actually is. I'd have to, one, play it, two, actually look at some level maps. But, I've heard a lot of good things about Tokitori for a while, and that's the only reason. That's why I picked it up. So, we'll see later. Maybe I'll play some of that on stream. Doesn't really matter. At this point, we must move on. Randomness in games. So, yeah, now we're going to talk about the do's and don'ts of honest puzzle game design. Let me just grab this. And if you want to check out this score I gave to the Mark Brown piece, you can check that out in a second. But I updated it as after I just watched the video, so that information is now available to you. I can do this. And here's your new information for our next video. Do's and don'ts of foot. That's supposed to be 62. I just copied the same one twice. There we go. Here's the new information for this new video. Made by Matthew Van Devane.
Hello everyone, my name is Matthew Van Diemender, and the name of this talk is the do's and don'ts of honest puzzle game design.
This one looks like it's really long. Let's see. And this guy is actually giving a talk from his car. I think that was pretty cool. I think I watched this, so I must have checked out the whole thing, or at least most of it. This is a kind of a concept that's been floating around recently of people talking about honest puzzle design, which kind of extends to the same mindset that people have been recently talking about games that quote-unquote respect the intelligence or the time of the player. Just really sort of almost buzzwordy like phrases that people are throwing around to try to sort of merge a whole bunch of issues, game design potential issues, into like one phrase, and that's why it becomes nearly impossible to sort it out after they do that, because it's pretty much opening a can of worms every time. In the very basic idea of honest puzzle game design, it's essentially creating a puzzle, a logic puzzle, right? Something that, just like most games and most gameplay, something that informs the player so that they're not guessing about every single thing, something they can learn, something they can leverage their skills overcoming, and something that actually stresses their skills instead of, their patience or their ability to guess over time, right? So that's essentially something that you can apply to just about any genre, that basic concept. But people often talk about it with puzzle games because a lot of people still think of adventure game puzzles when they think of puzzles, right? And those games can often have very cryptic, illogical, pixel hunty sequences where the player has to do X and then Y then Z, and they don't tell you, they don't give you a hint to what that sequence is. They don't even tell you what items you need. Sometimes it can be literally just like clicking on things and randomly getting a thing you need. Sometimes some of those puzzles are just really what we'd consider to be pretty bad today, but if people consider that to be not so bad, that's why sometimes people feel like they need to make a distinction between those kinds of puzzles and what they call honest puzzle games. But for the most part, adventure games died for a reason, yet puzzle games are still being made by, not so much by big companies. I guess they were never that popular, but indies have always continued to make puzzle games, and they pop up all over the place, especially on handhelds and mobile devices. So, let's see what he has to say. We'll watch the first 10 minutes of this, and then we'll see what happens.
Which kind of, that naturally begs the question, what is an honest puzzle game? So I could put, just a bunch of pictures of different games up on the screen and say, hey, it's one of these, pretty much. But I don't think that that's particularly helpful, because if you don't already understand what I'm talking about, or you haven't played these games, then that really doesn't mean anything. So I'd like to go a little bit more in depth on what I mean by honest puzzle games. But the first thing I'd like to do is try to talk about how most games use their puzzles, which is kind of as a way of just obstructing the player's progression through the game. So maybe there's some other core gameplay, maybe you're shooting or it's a platformer or something, but the designers decided that they want to slow you down or change the pace in some way, and so they put in like a puzzle, and now you have to solve this puzzle before you can continue through the rest of the game. So this is just an example of that kind of puzzle from Monkey Island 2. But there's a lot of type of games that use this puzzle, not just adventure games. In this situation, you've come to this graveyard here, and there's a crypt here that you want to get into. But unfortunately, the door is locked, and you need to find a key. So where's that key? Well, the designer's hidden it in a totally different place, on a totally different island, far, far away. And it's on the wall here inside of this coffin shop. Unfortunately, it's behind the cash register, and the shopkeeper does not want you to go back there because he thinks you're going to rob the place. And so you kind of have to, do a little bit of coercion here and talk to him and say, hey, man, I'm looking for a good used coffin. And so he shows you this coffin over here, and, he gets a little overzealous. He's excited. Maybe you're going to buy this coffin. Nobody buys these coffins. I mean, everything's on discount here. Look. Nobody's dying. So he climbs inside the coffin to show you, hey, look how much, it'll fit you just fine. And if you happen to have a hammer that you found earlier in the game, then you can nail him into the coffin and then go get the key and, of course, go back to the crypt and unlock it. So lots of people like this game, and it's not, I'm not really trying to say that they're wrong for liking it. I mean, in fact, part of the reason that I picked this game is because I actually do like this game. Because you could think it would be really easy for me to pick a game like Gabriel Knight with like the cat hair mustache puzzle, and that everybody just kind of hates that puzzle. But I think by choosing a game that actually people do remember fondly, and remember fondly enough for it to, this is from a remake that came out quite a bit after the original game. I think by choosing a game like that people remember fondly, I can sort of make a more effective point. And that point is that people don't actually like this game for the puzzles. What they like about the game is all the layers that are on top of those puzzles. The art and the music and the funny jokes. And if we were to strip away all of that stuff, what you're left with is really just the core gameplay, which is kind of this boring sort of scavenger hunt where you're just going from place to place and you're looking for different items, random things, and you're using stuff on other stuff. And you may as well just be running around through a maze looking for a red key card, trying to unlock a red door. Only it's not even like in Doom or something, where you get to shoot some monsters on the way there, do something cool, because in this game the scavenger hunt is really all there is. So if you'll permit me to continue this line of thought, and I know it's reductionist, but you could say that the set dressing in this game is really the only thing that actually gives your actions any meaning. Because the core itself, that gameplay, that scavenger hunt that you're doing, is sort of meaningless, especially if we think about it in terms of like a series of keys and locked doors. But you bubble up through those layers of production, and it sort of gathers meaning as it goes, where, okay, this key becomes a hammer, and the locked door, it turns into a coffin that you have to nail shut. So you could say, in a way, that with this type of game design, the designer is actually being kind of dishonest with you, because they're trying to trick you in a way about what you're actually doing, and make you think that something that's sort of fundamentally boring in a way is actually fun. So when I talk about honest puzzle game design, I'm really talking about like the opposite of that kind of puzzle, where the puzzle itself here is actually the core value proposition of the game. And you still want to put those layers on top, right, and it makes it better, but the puzzles themselves are actually good enough to be the reason that you want to play the game. So it's kind of hard to succinctly explain exactly what an honest puzzle looks like, because so much of what that means has to do with like the subjective experience that you have when you're solving one of those puzzles. but I'll try to give an example. So this game is called The Swapper. It's a really good puzzle game. If you haven't played it, you definitely should, especially because I'm about to spoil a puzzle in the game. It's an early puzzle. It's not a big deal, but you know, I try to be upfront. So the way the game works is that you have this device that allows you to create up to 4 clones of yourself. And the other thing that you can do with the device is you can point it at one of those clones, and then you can swap which one of the clones that you're controlling. And a little bit into the game, maybe about an hour in, it depends on, you know, how fast you're going. You come into this room here from the right, and there's this big opening in the ceiling with an arrow that's pointing up. And so when you get to it, it's obvious, you see the arrow, well obviously I'm supposed to go up there, but you don't really know how you could do that with the stuff that you've done so far in the game. And it's kind of a Metroidvania sort of structure where you're going around, and in those kind of games a lot of times you pick up different power-ups throughout the game, so maybe you keep going, you'll get a jetpack or something. It's kind of this space game, so that seems like a possibility. If you had a jetpack, you could just fly right up there, right? So you keep going down to the left, and you just sort of pass up this gap here, and you solve some more puzzles, and eventually you come back here, and this is the only thing that is left. So obviously you have to be able to get up there. And so you fiddle around for a little bit, and you figure out this maneuver that's a little bit strange, but because you can make a clone of yourself up in the air and then swap to it before that clone hits the ground, you can sort of do this bunny hop maneuver where you climb up out of that pit. So when you get to this puzzle, you've been playing the game for a little while, right? And you've solved quite a few puzzles. So when you make this actual discovery, it's kind of this epiphanous moment, because there's this ability that you really had the whole time, but you just now realized it. So part of that is kind of it's this subtle feeling that you have when you make that discovery, and that's probably impossible to get across in a talk, because there's a difference between the actual experience of solving puzzles when you're playing a puzzle game versus just like watching someone else do it. Because when you're solving it yourself, it's like this realization where, you know, you're trying out different ideas, and you're sort of doing a experimentation process where you think, well, maybe this will do it, and you try something out and it doesn't work, and eventually you solve the puzzle in your head because you come up with an idea and it kind of clicks, and you try it and it's in sync. And it's kind of this beautiful feeling, whereas if you were to just watch someone else solve the puzzle, it's really like, well, I know that's possible because I saw them do it, right? So I'd like to go back to that earlier point from Monkey Island about the layers, because this game, like Monkey Island, it has those kind of layers on top of it. There's a lot of production values where there's beautiful art and music, and there's this dramatic storytelling, and the developers have clearly done a lot of work to really make the game appealing. So what would happen here if we were to kind of strip away all that polish, similar to Monkey Island? The answer is nothing really. I mean, it would make the game worse, right? It would make the game uglier in some ways, but even if you were just playing as orange boxes, it would still, in some ways, it would have the same core to it that's beautiful and interesting in some of the same ways as the final game. And that means that the game's puzzles actually have beauty at their core. And so you can still add those layers on top, but now you can be honest, and you want to be honest because you don't want to hide that beauty, you don't want to hide that thing that's great about the puzzle, you actually want to show it off and make it better if you can. So I don't really want to disparage the other type of puzzle, but I'm trying to make a point that when I talk about honest puzzle game design, I'm really just talking about kind of a different way of thinking about puzzle design. So how do we design an honest puzzle game? So I'm going to start first with sort of a broad level overview of what that design process looks like, and then I'll get into more details later. So in the first stage of the design, you're starting with an idea, and that idea is kind of a mechanic or a set of rules, but you're looking for a sort of an idea where it's a simple rule set, but you don't know all the consequences of those rules. But in the second stage, you're sort of going out and you're like kind of an explorer. You're exploring this territory of, of the systems that were created with those rules. And you build out some situations and you challenge yourself to see what you can do with that rule set. And you're looking for interesting discoveries in that. And you might find a little bit, or you might find a lot. And if you don't find much, maybe you move on to another idea, you try out some different things, and you shelve this one. You're not throwing it away, but you're putting it up so maybe later you can come back to it with fresh eyes, and maybe you'll see something about it that you didn't see before. But if you do find a lot, then you can sort of, after that experimentation process, you can move into this final part of the design process where you're actually bringing back the most interesting stuff that you found in that exploration. And you're taking basically those situations that you built to challenge yourself and refining them down, and you're curating the ideas in the game and distilling them down into a series of puzzles that sort of teach the player about the stuff that you found. And in this process, each puzzle itself is like an illustration of an interesting consequence of the rule set of your game. The player goes through and they solve those puzzles, and they're learning things as from each puzzle, and hopefully they can take that knowledge forward and solve more difficult puzzles that kind of build on that earlier knowledge. So in this type of puzzle design, it's a different type of puzzle design where every puzzle actually it has a point in the game. It's expressing something about the rules of the game, and your job as a designer is to understand what the role of that puzzle is, why it's there, and what the ideas are behind it, so that you can express that most effectively to the player. Because if a player solves a puzzle in your game and they haven't learned anything and they haven't understood why they solved the puzzle, then you've kind of failed as a game designer. So I like truthful puzzle games, and they're the kind of puzzle game that I try to design, but they seem to be kind of rare, so they must be hard to design, at least a little bit, right? So the rest of the talk is sort of more concrete tips and techniques and tools, that you can use to help you design truthful puzzle games well. And the structure of the talk is sort of a series of pairs of do's and don'ts, where each pair is kind of talking about the same thing, but they come at it from a different direction. So the first thing is kind of a broad level approach that's called designing forward. Now, this was a term that I first heard coined by Jonathan Blow and Daniel Benmergui, but I was actually using this approach before I ever heard the term. So, the approach and the terminology, it's a name for something that already existed, right? So there's two levels to designing forward, but they're both sort of about this fundamental unsurety that you have when you're designing about what the final result of that process is going to be. And the first level is on the whole of the project, where everything that you do is sort of couched in this experimental spirit, where you're open to new ideas and you're constantly prototyping throughout the process and trying out additional and new mechanics, a lot of times much later in development than you normally would. So I'll talk about that in a little bit, but first I'd like to talk about kind of a second level, or maybe a lower level of designing forward, which is as a method of designing individual puzzles. So what that means is that you start by building a scenario, and you're setting up a challenge for yourself. You're thinking, hey, okay, I have these rules, I have this system, I wonder if I could do this. Like, could I get over there? Could I press these two buttons? But you don't know whether or not you can do that. You just set up a scenario to try to challenge yourself to do something and see if you can. And this is a great method of design, because even if you actually can't do that thing, you can't solve the puzzle, just by challenging yourself to do something that you don't know whether you can do with the system, it puts you in this focused mindset where you're using the mechanics of the game as a tool to solve problems. And that leads you to making discoveries about how the systems in the game behave. So even if you actually can't do what you were setting out to do, you might make some discoveries or learn some things about systems in the game that lead you down the path to building some other puzzles. Another good aspect of this design method is that because you're discovering things that surprise even you, actually, when you discover them, in some sense, those things you didn't really design, and so you can have a bit more of a more objective measure of how good those things are, because your ego is not really involved in it. You know, you're not thinking like, oh, I'm terrible, and so all these puzzles are terrible, or oh, I'm awesome and I feel good about myself, or I want to feel good about myself, so I'm going to say that these puzzles are good even if they're not. And also, for a similar reason, you have a sort of a rough idea of how difficult the challenges are in the game, because you actually did have to solve them yourself as part of the design process. And that means that the solutions are also kind of going to gravitate towards those type of solutions that can be solved through intuition. So the natural counterpoint to designing forwards is what you might call designing backwards, or backwards design, which is a nice term, I think, because it's both descriptive of the method of design, but it also maybe implies something a little bit negative about the quality of puzzles that are designed this way. So backwards design is where we start with the puzzle and it's in sort of a solved state to begin with, and then to build the puzzle we're actually just shuffling around the pieces and asking the player to like put it back together. So if there's a benefit to this method, you could say that that the difficulty of the puzzle is kind of arbitrary, because you can just shuffle up the pieces more, and the puzzle gets harder. As an example, adventure games do tend to be designed with this method, where you kind of have something that's a simple situation, like, okay, as the player wants to get into the castle gardens or something, but as a designer you say, okay, well, we're going to layer on obfuscation and make that more difficult. So, first stage, well, we lock the door because, they need to lock the door. They got to find the key. Well, maybe it's too easy if they find the key, so let's make it to where they find a mold for a key. But, they can't just melt anything down in there because this is a magic door, and so they need to have gold. It has to have a golden key to unlock the door. But gold, well, if gold was just, in your inventory all the time, that would make this a really trivial puzzle. So let's make it to where gold's really rare in this land, and, nobody knows, but there's a legend that says that, there's a golden magician's chastity belt in the tower across the land, and if you could just make it there, then you could get that, and you could melt it down in the dwarven mines and fill your mold with the gold, and finally maybe you could get around to unlocking the door. So we can think of these forwards and backwards design on some kind of like puzzle design continuum, where forwards design is on the right. It sort of naturally gravitates towards these puzzles that are maybe harder to design because they're designed through kind of an exploration process that's not entirely predictable, but you end up with these puzzles that are easier to solve through intuitive means, and they're also in some sense more truthful because you didn't totally specify what that solution was. You just discovered it. And then on the other end, you're going to have backwards design, where the puzzles are a lot easier to design because you're just kind of arbitrarily specifying a solution. But they're harder to solve because you also arbitrarily shuffled it up and made it more difficult. And maybe they're less satisfying that way. So most puzzles are not really totally on the right-hand side of this or totally on the left-hand side. There's some mixture, of fully truthful and a little bit arbitrary and contrived, but generally we're wanting to head towards that right-hand side of the continuum there. So let's go back to that other level, the more broad level of designing forward, which is that experimental mindset, right? So when you're designing, you want to be experimenting a lot. And the natural first step, in an experimental design process is just that you're prototyping out your ideas, because what is a prototype other than kind of an experimental version, a simple version of your game? But that begs the question of where do you get new ideas? Unfortunately, as much as I'd like to tell you that, I'm not really sure I can explain that because ideas are just kind of this mysterious thing. And if I could explain it, then ultimately I think that's going to be kind of its own lecture. But in the meantime, I'd like to answer, I feel like, a different and maybe easier question, which is actually how do you tell the difference between a good idea and a bad idea? Because of course you have to prototype your ideas to know whether they're good, but how do you even know what good looks like if you haven't seen it before? So in the past, I had a problem as a designer, and I think it actually is kind of a common problem, especially when you're starting out early, where you're sort of in the middle of this languishing project, and you believe man, if I just work harder on this, if I just put enough stuff into it, if I just put enough good ideas into it, you know, it's going to be great. You know, but it's not great, and it's sort of this unfulfilling work, and you're unsatisfied. Unfortunately, the vast majority of ideas are like this. They're mundane and mediocre. And the problem with like mediocre ideas is that they're not obviously bad, and they kind of seem like they could be good if you just worked a little harder, you know, if you were just a little smarter, a little bit better. So don't fall into that trap, you know, where you're working on a mediocre idea, because a great idea is obviously great when you find it. Like, there's no question in your mind about whether or not it's a great thing. You don't have to think about it. So, you know, you need to continue trying out new ideas until you do actually find something that's so great that you actually can't not work on it. So I've been working on this game for a while called Duet. And there's a few different things that led into the idea, but the main one was like a sense of a lack of true cooperation in games. You know, because even games that purported to have co-op, you know, like the Halo games or something, really what they did is like, okay, well, you know, you're the Master Chief and you're shooting some guys, and we want to have like a multiplayer mode, so let's just put like another Master Chief in there, but you're both shooting the same guys. But really, you're sort of acting independently. You know, and so the original design, it just kind of came out as this scribble in Microsoft Paint. And this is just a recreation of that, because unfortunately I don't have the original drawing, because it was years and years ago, and I've had like hard drive crashes since then and stuff. But the drawing was really simple. It just had this tall, narrow green character, and this short, squat, kind of squat red one. And then arrows drawn to indicate that the green character would jump twice as high as the red one, and the red character would sort of run twice as fast as the green one. And so the idea, you know, this really simple cooperative platformer game with these basic rules that could just be sketched out really simply, it seemed interesting, but I didn't totally know just from that what all the ramifications would be. So I built out this prototype of the game, and I was like totally surprised, because there was way, way more there than I actually predicted or could have predicted or expected. You know, and I just built the prototype in a few hours. It was a little bit janky. The controls weren't that great. The camera was like this weird sluggish thing that was just like the default camera in Game Maker. But the puzzles themselves were actually so good that almost everything that you see here in this prototype level has survived through to the game as it is now. And it was really this epiphanous moment as a designer, because designing this game was not like anything I'd worked on before. You know, it was thrilling. It was like so obviously better than anything else that I was working on or had ever worked on. And the ideas that I discovered, you know, as I was experimenting with the game were better than the ones that I actually had going in, or the ideas that I had for other projects. So, you know, after this process, after this experience, I really couldn't think about game design, especially puzzle game design, the same way. So really what I'm trying to say is, like, if you're not working on a project that's like that, then you just haven't found it yet. And you need to keep prototyping and trying out new ideas until you find that. So more specifically, what are we looking for in a prototype, though? You know, how do we know that it's a good idea, right? You know, for this kind of puzzle game. So the clearest indicator is going to be surprise, because if there's something about the game that surprised you, you know, there's something about that you didn't totally design, right? The other thing that you're looking for is depth, and depth is like the measure of the richness of the possibility space of a game. And you're looking for maximal depth with minimal contrivance. Another way of putting that is that you're looking for the most number of surprising consequences with the fewest number of rules.
I'm going to pause it right here and jot down a few notes about what he just said. Backing up a little bit.
With the fewest, another way, depth. The other thing that you're looking for is depth, and depth is like the measure of the richness of the possibility space of game.
Measure of the richness of the possibility space in a game. I should have put on the closed captioning. You everyone, depth, the measure of the richness of the possibility space. Yeah, he's kind of talking about puzzle games in the content anyway. Design space, obviously. It's funny. In our DO category system, we have design space, and depth is something that goes into that design space. It's a subcategory of it. And if you listen to a lot of the different definitions people have, it seems to line up pretty nicely in this case. You replace possibility space with the word design space, and it seems to fit perfectly. But everybody kind of that's design space. And then we actually put those pieces together in actual levels. You know, it's level design. It's a pretty easy way to think about it.
Design surprised you, it's because there's the other thing that you're looking for that you didn't totally design, right? The other thing that you're looking for is depth, and depth is like the measure of the richness of the possibility space of a game. And you're looking for maximal depth with minimal contrivance. Another way of putting it, there's the other thing that you're looking for that you didn't totally design, right? The other thing that you're looking for is depth, and depth is like the measure of the richness of the possibility space of a game. And you're looking for maximal depth with minimal contrivance. Another way of putting that is that you're looking for the most number of surprising consequences with the fewest number of rules. So again, most of your ideas are going to be mediocre. So how do you work through that slog of design and not get lost trying to polish a turd or something? And how do you maintain your motivation too when you're working on stuff and most of it's unsatisfying? So let's just do a little bit of a thought experiment. And let's say you prototyped out an idea. And when you worked on it, you discovered something so great working on it that it changes who you are as a person. And the idea is extremely generous and it just gives you back way more than you put into it and changes your life. And it's not like your other ideas where you want to work hard to make the thing great, but it's like the thing is already great, but you really want to work hard to live up to that. You want to live up to the core of the game with everything else that you're putting in. So there's a question about, how many lame prototypes would that be worth? I think it's a lot, so, don't get discouraged. So you want to take that experimentation process and sort of methodology into the rest of designing the game. So you're trying to, come up with new ideas that actually interact with your older ones in some interesting ways. So in Duet, I had an idea at one point that was sort of these blocks that would make the players float up when they were inside of them. And so I built out a level to sort of test that out, and really this was the only level I built because when I tried it out, it wasn't really that interesting. Uh-oh. Come on, Starbucks, reconnect. Okay, looks like it dropped temporarily. Okay. So I tried out these blocks, and it really wasn't that interesting because there was nothing surprising about it, and there were no consequences that I didn't initially expect. There was nothing about it that I couldn't have predicted before I designed it. And so ultimately there were not really any puzzles that came out of it, and I ended up cutting that mechanic. So eventually you're going to reach a point in the design where you've tried out a lot of different things, but you're unsure with the mechanics that you have whether or not you've explored all the possibilities. And it can be hard to be totally sure of that sometimes. But one thing that can really help is to just doodle with the elements of the game. And I mean that literally. If you have an editor, this is GameMaker, that lets you just draw out arbitrary shapes with your gameplay pieces and see what happens, then do that. Because, you know, it kind of, by just doodling out stuff, it frees you up from, you know, rigid structures that you might otherwise make, and might help you to make new discoveries or get some new ideas about how to make some different puzzles. It can't hurt even if you don't find anything. So you're experimenting a lot, but you don't want to forget to take out the trash, because you'll be ending up with a lot of puzzles due to this exploratory kind of design process, but most of them are not going to be very good. And you have to remember that nothing that you design as part of this process is sacred, and you want to cut everything that you can if it's going to make the game better. You know, so if you have something in the game that's like not really living up to what you feel like is the potential of the game, or it's not as good as the best thing, then, you know, maybe there's a way for you to make it better, but you should also consider whether or not it actually makes the game better to just remove it completely. As an example, here's a few different puzzles from Duet, and they all are different than the puzzles that actually made it into the final game in some way. They have interesting things about them and unique aspects, but they also all had kind of annoying aspects, and the bad sort of outweighed the good. There's also this overlap a lot of times with puzzles that were already in the game, where they were just a little bit too similar, so I ended up cutting all of these puzzles. So an overall approach that I think suits truthful puzzle game design well is minimalism. And part of that is because sometimes the most beautiful puzzles are those that express subtle and maybe complex ideas, but they do it with very few elements. So you're trying to do more with less, really. And that aesthetic of minimalism, it comes out of this fundamental humility where you have a respect for the fact that the player has a limited amount of time in their life, in general, literally, but just from day to day too. And they could have spent that time doing anything else, but they've chosen to spend some time and maybe some of their money on your game because they believe that you're going to show them something truly beautiful, and you don't want to let them down. You want to respect that and not waste their time by asking them to do stuff like run needlessly across big open spaces between puzzles, or just play around with mechanics that are not really that interesting. Another way of putting our desire to be minimalist is to say that we don't want to be maximalist. And I know maximalist sounds like a word that I just made up, and I don't blame you. Even LibreOffice thought it was a word I made up, but it's actually a real thing. It was an art movement that was sort of a counterpoint to the minimalist art movement, only this art movement was all focused on excess. So normally it's a bit hard to give good examples from puzzle games, because if you don't understand the mechanics of the game, then there's a certain amount of explanation that has to be done to get you up to speed before you can even give an example of what you're talking about. But I think actually this example is so bad that it works better if you haven't played the game. So the way that all puzzle games work is there's a certain amount of confusion, right? Because as a player, you're coming into a situation, you don't totally understand it, and anything that's on the screen could actually be important to the puzzle. And designing a puzzle game means you're accepting that confusion. You're accepting a certain amount of confusion, but it's important to keep things as clear and straightforward as possible. Okay, so if you played this game, then just imagine that for a second that you haven't, and you're coming into this situation, this puzzle, totally blind. How much of this puzzle actually matters? It's actually quite hard to tell, isn't it? So what I've done here is I've highlighted all of the extraneous elements of the puzzle, everything that's just decorative, and most of these things you can't even collide with. So don't do that. And you might say, well, gee, Matthew, that's really limiting, from an art direction standpoint. Maybe I want to decorate my stuff. And okay, that's the point. It's limiting, yes, because there's a limit, to how much stuff that you can put on the screen. Because when you put unrelated items on the screen, you're really obscuring the puzzle in a lot of ways, and you're decreasing the player's ability to actually understand it, and also the enjoyment that they're going to get from solving it. So what you should be doing is you should be communicating to the player where they should direct their attention. What is the relevant stuff, and limit how much extra things are going on. So another way that maximalism might manifest in puzzle games is through redundancy. So this is an example from the Talos Principle, which I actually think is a pretty good game. It has some good puzzles. There's some low points, but it's not a bad game. So I feel like this example may be a little unfair, especially because it's one of the optional puzzles in the game. But it was a good example that really kind of visually expressed redundancy. So in this puzzle, there's these series of rooms here, and in each room there's these little, you can see those spheres there, and those spheres are sort of these mines that move back and forth in a straight line. And if you get too close to them, they'll blow up and you have to start the whole puzzle over again. So as part of this puzzle, you're using these jammers to adjust the mine's phase, or just freeze them so you can get past them, or maybe you're just being crafty and you try to fit between narrow spaces or something. So it's really kind of this obstacle course. But the thing about it is when you get to this puzzle, you see these 3 rooms, and they're all kind of the same thing, like there's this redundancy going on. It feels like a betrayal of the trust as a player that you put in the game designer to not waste your time. So I think, an important thing to take away from this is, like, if the only reason that a player would want to solve a puzzle that you put in your game is because, like, there's a little trinket they get, and if they get 10 of those, then they get a special secret ending or something, it's probably a bad puzzle. So there's a few tools that we want to use as truthful puzzle game designers to help our puzzles express their ideas. And one of those tools is reprises. So reprises, what they are, is a reiteration of surface level design for illustrative purposes. So you set up this level layout, and it's kind of a motif that you can restate later in the game as part of a puzzle that's actually very different. A good example of reprises is Braid, because it does them a lot. So here we have 2 different puzzles that are both visually similar, but they're completely different when you play them. So if you haven't played Braid, you should really fix that as soon as possible. But it's this game that's about time manipulation, and it's split up into these different worlds, and in each world it explores some different aspect of how time might behave or what it means to manipulate time. So in the first version of the motif here on the left, time actually just behaves kind of normally how it does in the real world, more or less. But on the reprise on the right-hand side, time actually behaves totally differently, where it's tied to your position. When you move to the right, time moves forward, and when you move to the left, time moves backwards. So let's look at another short video from Braid. And you can see here, it's a little bit hard to tell, but on the right you can notice that time is moving backwards when the snowflakes fall up. The other thing to notice is to watch the little guys sort of move backwards. So why do we want to use reprises? Well, by echoing the structure of puzzles earlier in the game, we can give the player something kind of familiar to work with, and that makes the puzzle concepts a little bit easier to grasp. Of course, you can also use it as a method of misdirection, where the player assumes that they can solve the puzzle using the same technique because it's similar visually to the earlier puzzle, but then they're actually shocked and surprised when it turns out that the puzzle's different, and their same actions have a totally different outcome. So either way, it can kind of be used as a method to create clarity, where you're emphasizing how the new contrasts with the old. So while working on this talk, I designed this really short puzzle game called Opposition, totally differently grasp. Of course, you can also use puzzle using the same technique because it's similar visually to the earlier puzzle, but then they're actually shocked and surprised when it turns out that the puzzle's different, and their same actions have a totally different outcome. So either way, it can kind of be used as a method to create clarity, where you're emphasizing how the new contrasts with the old. So while working on this talk, I designed this really short puzzle game called Opposition. It was built using PuzzleScript, which is a tool by Stephen Lavelle, and you should totally check it out because it's awesome. And the game it has this structure where it's divided into 2 acts, and kind of the interesting thing about it is that the second act is like a complete level-for-level reprise of the first act. And actually here this created an interesting dramatic tension in the second act, because you might, when you realize that it's all echoing the first act, you might think, oh well, there was a puzzle that was really hard in the first act, but now it's just going to be harder because now I've got more guys to contend with, and these puzzles have all been more difficult. So though occasionally we want to reprise earlier puzzles and level layouts, reprise earlier level layouts, but for new puzzles, we don't want to repeat ourselves. Because I really want to drive home that point that reprises are not repetitive, because the puzzles themselves are different, and they have to be solved differently. Now, it could be almost an identical puzzle, but with one piece added or removed, as long as it makes a completely different and interesting solution, it's probably worth doing. But you do want to avoid significant overlap between your original motif, and its reprise, because if the solution to the reprise is only like an alternate solution to the original puzzle, you have to remember that some players are going to solve that original puzzle with that alternate solution, and then they're going to solve them both the same way and kind of wondering why you were wasting their time with the same puzzle twice. So in that case, you want to kind of consider allowing players to maybe miss that alternate solution, or if you can, you might want to redesign the earlier puzzle to where like the more complex solution is more obvious and the simpler one is a little bit less obvious. So another tool that's kind of similar in some ways to reprises is sequences. So sequences are like a series of puzzles or parts of like a bigger puzzle that have to be solved in a specific linear order. Another way of thinking of them is like as a paragraph of puzzles, where each puzzle, it might intersect with each other conceptually or even spatially, or both. So Jonathan Blow's follow-up to Braid, The Witness, actually uses sequences a lot, and it does it in this very visual way. In each of these scenarios, the player is solving a series of puzzle panels by drawing, trying to figure out what's the correct line to draw on the panel. And the puzzles proceed from left to right, and they gradually introduce sort of an abstract idea through a series of examples and counterexamples. But inside of each puzzle panel, the player is free to explore and make mistakes and discover, through trial and error, what the correct line to draw is. But as they go through, if they're perceptive, then they can sort of build up this intuition where they end up solving the puzzles more based on understanding what the concepts that they're about are rather than just trial and error. And so these puzzles on the left are sort of about partitioning space using your line to draw between these black and white dots. The puzzles on the right, I haven't played the game, so I don't really know what they're about. So maybe I'm wrong, but I think that it's reasonable to assume that they're kind of a similar process where they're a series of puzzles that introduce this idea over time, or they introduce variations on it to allow you to understand it on a more intuitive level. So I wanted to show off sequences in kind of a different context through a live demo, but unfortunately my laptop couldn't really handle it, so I had to sort of pre-record the demo as just another video. So I'm going to go away for a little bit because I thought about doing narration alongside it live, but it didn't really work out, so it just sort of worked better to record it. But if I go away, then at least like you're not watching me play a live demo.
So this is from the C++ version of Duet. This is kind of just an example of what a sequence might look like in a different style of game than The Witness. So this is at the beginning of the second world in the game, so it's not that far into the game. And kind of the main change in this world is that the players can collide with each other and push each other around, which is sort of, what you would expect. And this is just a really basic sequence, and it kind of, it really is one puzzle, but it has these steps to it where each step is kind of its own thing. both figuratively and literally, because we do have this sort of staircase thing going on. And so we have this first step here where the red player can't jump up this ledge because it's too high, and the green player can quite easily make it up there because the green player has a double jump. Actually, the green player can make it all the way up here, but they can't make it up this wall. And so the players kind of just have to work together, where the green player gives the red player a boost here, and then they can get up there. But then on the second one, the red player can't make it just by jumping, and so they have to both work together with jumping, where the green player jumps and then the red player jumps. Actually, I'm not even sure the red player needs to jump. I think, yeah, okay. The red player can just kind of walk over the ledge. But the third one requires the green player to jump twice, and then the red player can't actually walk over that ledge. The red player has to jump as well. And because the green player couldn't make it up here before, now that the red player's up there, who's the only one that can get up there, if they work together, just, through their physics interactions. But now the red player can hold down a button, and the green player can make it up here and solve the puzzle.
So, why do we want to use sequences? Well, for a similar reason to using the reprises, because the subject matter that we're trying to communicate through a puzzle might be a little bit subtle or difficult to grasp. And sequences allow us to break up a bigger puzzle into kind of a series of bite-sized chunks so that the player can solve each chunk and use those as like stair steps towards understanding the core idea. And that makes puzzles easier, which sort of brings up this interesting point, which is, normally you might think that a good puzzle has to be difficult, right? But actually no, because as part of this puzzle design type, making hard puzzles is not really the goal. It's just sort of a natural side effect of having deep subject matter. Your goal is communicating that subject matter and communicating the ideas effectively. And difficult ideas are just naturally going to be a little bit difficult to grasp, but easy ones should be easy to grasp, and you don't want to make them harder. So a good example of how that, trying to make things easier works out in practice is Miagakure, which is this puzzle platformer that's in 4 spatial dimensions. And so if you think about what does the 4th spatial dimension mean, you could see how it would be really easy to design a game about that's impossible to understand and maybe impossible to even play. But instead, what Miagakure tries to do is it tries very hard to reduce down that complexity of that concept while still really maintaining a true, 4th dimensional space. So the design of the game is actually about making the beauty of the 4th dimension more appreciable to the human senses. And allowing players to maybe intuitively grasp kind of what the 4th dimension feels like, or what that means, at least in some small sense. So although we want to make sequences when we can, and make our concepts that are difficult concepts easier to grasp, we want to avoid creating labyrinths. So what is a labyrinth? Well, we all know it's a movie with David Bowie in it, with, crazy hair, and I don't know, what is he holding there? I mean, look at that. That's just weird. But in the context of puzzle games, a labyrinth is sort of similar to the classical idea of a labyrinth, which is the structure that's kind of similar to a maze, but the main difference is that it has no branches. And the only difficulty that it has is really just through being long and arduous. There's no real way to get lost unless you just fell asleep or spun around a lot and forgot which way you were going. So you might think of a labyrinth in a puzzle game as being like a straightforward but elaborate puzzle that's built up of a series of trivial elements. Maybe another way of thinking of it is as like a boring sequence. So labyrinths come out of that difficulty-oriented mindset about puzzle game design that I talked about earlier, where you sort of feel like it's required that the puzzles in your game be difficult. So when I was first designing the puzzles for Duet, I sort of found myself in that situation where I was really inspired a lot by Braid, but part of what I liked about Braid was that a lot of the puzzles were pretty tricky. But here I was designing this game that for the most part the puzzles were pretty easy, and some of them were so easy that maybe they weren't puzzles. I mean, they were interesting, but I started to feel a little bit insecure and worried about that maybe people would think the game was too easy and maybe they wouldn't like it for that. And so what I proceeded to do is I designed this puzzle that was really complicated, but it was built up out of a lot of simple elements. You know, it took longer to solve, but it was just because it had a whole bunch of steps that were really straightforward individually. You know, there was this interesting feeling to the puzzle in some ways, but it was also really unsatisfying, and it was probably the worst puzzle that I designed. So I ended up cutting the puzzle. But usually when I cut things, I don't just totally forget about it. Instead, I kind of think about, well, there was something about that. And so I stowed that away in the back of my mind because, you know, I didn't know what to call that thing. But then I played the Talos Principle, and here's another maybe negative example from the Talos Principle. But and later in the game, there was this puzzle that was called the Labyrinth. So here's a screenshot of the puzzle. It's sort of a bird's eye view. Unfortunately, you know, as I said earlier about puzzle games, it's sort of hard to explain the details of the puzzle because, you know, there's been a lot of mechanics introduced over the game, and you know, it takes hours to introduce those mechanics. But suffice to say that this puzzle had the exact same feeling as that puzzle that I had designed in Duet. So now I knew what the name for it was because this puzzle had a name, and that name was Labyrinths. So, you know, kind of the aspect of labyrinths is that they're trivial to solve, right? I mean, that can be for a couple reasons. They could just be like a repeat of things that were actually difficult earlier in the game, things that were quite challenging, but now you've sort of done them a million times, and so, you know, they're just simple. Or it could be stuff that you've done in a lot of other games, or, you know, it could just be plain trivial. Labyrinths could be defined as a puzzle that is arduous to execute, mostly from like a time standpoint, but it's conceptually very simple to grasp. But you kind of want the opposite of that, right? You want puzzles that are easy to execute once you actually understand them, but they're complex conceptually, and so they might be difficult to grasp. But again, difficulty is not the goal, because you don't want to make concepts harder than they already are. So let's go back to forwards design and experimentation. So we want to iterate on the design of the puzzles in the game. And iteration is sort of experimentation, but within the context of an individual puzzle. So we're not trying to come up with new puzzles or new mechanics, but we're just trying to improve one puzzle. And since the puzzles in this type of truthful puzzle game, honest puzzle game, are intended to express, you know, certain ideas about the systems underlying the game, it's possible that there's better or worse ways of expressing the same thing. And if you can, you want to try out different versions of the puzzle and, you know, look for maybe what is the best version of whatever it is that expresses those ideas. So here's another example from Duet. And this is a very early puzzle in the game, and it kind of introduces two ideas. One is this button and block relationship, you know, where what happens when you press down these buttons, and it creates a block that appears when you press the button down. And the other is the relationship between the two players' differing jump heights, as that has an effect on making it over vertical obstacles. So there's a few different versions here. So you've got the first version, that's sort of the basic, you know, original prototypical version of it, where you just have a button, and when you press that button, the green block there appears. But then I tried another version where I used this different type of button that actually sort of works in an opposite method, where when you press the button down, the blocks are already there, but when you press the button down, the blocks disappear. But if you think about it, you know, structurally, it's pretty much the same thing as the first puzzle. But the only real difference is that the button has gotten moved up on top of the ledge. So I tried out a version with the original block mechanic with the button up on top of the ledge, but ultimately I moved it back to the original method because there was something about it to where when you put the button before the wall, you could be sure that the player wasn't missing any information when they were trying to solve the puzzle. You know, when they were trying to get the red player up above the wall who can't jump as high, you were sure that they didn't know you were sure that they were aware of what the button did. And then on the bottom right here is the current version, which adds this little pit here that's kind of a reinforcement of that smaller ledge concept, to kind of, solidify that idea in the player's mind about, the difference between the height of these walls, because one wall is exactly half as tall as the other. Of course, that adds a little bit of complexity there, so I may iterate it some more and decide to remove that. Although we want to iterate and we want to try to have the best versions of our puzzles, in that process it can be very easy to slip into perfectionism. And you don't want to be satisfied completely because that's part of your drive towards excellence, but you have to remember that it's never going to be perfect. So I'd like to read a little bit of an excerpt from Art and Fear, which is a book by David Bales and Ted Orland, and this excerpt is called Perfection. The ceramics teacher announced on opening day that he was dividing the class into 2 groups. All those on the left side of the studio, he said, would be graded solely on the quantity of work they produced, and all those on the right side solely on its quality. His procedure was simple. On the final day of class, he would bring in his bathroom scales and weigh the work of the quantity group, 50 pounds of pots rated an A, 40 pounds of pots a B, and so on. Those being graded on quality, however, needed to produce only 1 pot, albeit a perfect one, to get an A. Well, came grading time and a curious fact emerged. The works of highest quality were all produced by the group being graded for quantity. It seems that while the quantity group was busily churning out piles of work and learning from their mistakes, the quality group had sat theorizing about perfection and in the end had little more to show for their efforts than grandiose theories and a pile of dead clay. So perfection is a nice goal, but it's unachievable, and at some point you have to release a game even when it's not perfect. So the final thing that you want to do is you want to break all of these rules. Don't listen to me. Following a set of guidelines too strictly will lead you down a path of making cold, impersonal games. So these aren't strict rules, but they're just tools in your toolbox. In a similar way, sour and bitter by themselves can kind of be unpleasant tastes, but an expert chef can wield them as tools to create delicious and balanced flavors. So I'd like to do a little bit of a brief addendum about story. I'm not really usually a stories and games type of person. I do like some story-focused games, but in my own designs, I've tended to avoid story. Oftentimes, you have to admit that stories and games are just kind of worse versions of stories in other types of media. But I've started to think about story in context of puzzle games a little bit more recently and started thinking about how I might use that, and so I think I might have some useful thoughts there. So I want to mention this quote from Ralph Koster's Theory of Fun that's always sort of stuck with me, in which he explained that story in games is sort of always destined to be a side dish for the brain, where the main course is the mechanics or the gameplay. And I think we can sort of easily draw a parallel between story in games and pictures or illustrations in books. And I believe for honest puzzle games, maybe the best use of story is to embrace that and use it as an illustration, where the written word itself is kind of maybe able to approach the same concepts as the rest of the game, but providing a different perspective. So I'd like to leave you with just a final thought. There's this gap between your ability to specify the rules of a system and your ability to predict or perhaps even understand the resulting consequences. In that gap are beautiful things, ideas for which you can only take partial credit for, which were discovered more than designed. These ideas, you have a different relationship to them than your other ideas, because you did not come up with them whole cloth, but instead, through cooperation with some greater part of the universe which you didn't and perhaps cannot understand. Thank you. So if you liked or didn't like the talk, you can, of course, reach me on Twitter. And if you really like the talk, then you could consider supporting me on Patreon. I have a Patreon there where you can talk.
So getting ready for our discussion, our stream later tonight, we have a lot of topics to think about. Honest puzzle design, meaningful experiences, solving puzzles rather than watching somebody else solving, reprises, sequences, tutorials, and let's scroll this to the left. And logic puzzles and the difference between solving and problem solving, puzzle solving and problem solving. All right, cool. So that was your 2-hour block of critical material, all centered around the theme of puzzle design and puzzle gameplay. We are doing this in preparation for better understanding The Witness, and by Friday we should come up with something quite profound and amazing to say about The Witness and what people have to say about The Witness. So stay tuned every week, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. We will be streaming content from around the world, different voices, different things to say on this theme, every 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, and then 9 p.m. Central Standard Time we'll have more of a direct research interview and live session researching the topic. So I'll see you guys later. This has been Richard Terrell, Kirby Kid with Design Oriented, and we will see you next time.